Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @theimprintnews. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business, policy, and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at SafeCampAudio on all social media. On this week's episode, we are joined by Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman, Associate Professor of American Ethnic Studies and Sociology at the University of Washington, Seattle, and author of Grandmothering While Black, a 21st century story of love, coercion, and survival. It's a really cool book. Dr. Pittman went deep on, serious interviews with dozens of grandmothers in the Chicago area who are, the heads of what she describes as skip generation households. So these are grandparents who are raising their grandbabies, by themselves, not in a household where there's kind of shared responsibility between them and parents or anybody else. So that's really the focus of the book. I talked to her about, the approach to coming up with this book and how she chose her subjects for it, and just got into what this book surfaces about the kinship care experience of Black grandmothers. It's obviously a timely subject, certainly a focal point in child welfare discussions right now is kinship care. You heard Rob Geen of the Bipartisan Policy Center on last week's episode talk about, how they have done national public polling about attitudes in the public about child welfare, really showed that the most consensus was around supporting kin and prioritizing them in the situations when children can't be living in the home that they've grown up in. On top of that, you've got the Biden administration having finalized new rules, making clear that, states can have an alternative path for approving kinship caregivers that can differ pretty substantially from the way that non-relative or stranger foster parents would be licensed. And importantly, that 4E federal funding can be used to pay for those placements. The Biden administration just also held a national convening on kinship care. Quick mention kind of off of this too. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but I wanted to kind of call out a cool resource that I think is going to pop up here pretty soon. The Annie Casey Foundation put out a collection, or started to put out a collection called Family Ties last week, and it included two things. First, the kind of top line report of a 50-state survey they did of kinship caregiving policies, which I think is a really helpful contribution to kind of see all of that. I'll drop a link to that work. It's kind of a little summary of the big picture findings. And then the other thing they put out is the first of what I think is going to be a planned slate of issue briefs that drill down more specifically into different topics around kinship care. This first one is called Unlocking Foster Care Licensing for More Kinship Caregivers. And that is, I'm assuming that's going first as a direct result of the Biden administration rules on this subject of how you can create an alternative path that more efficiently leads to approval of kinship caregivers to care for their loved ones. Anyway, it was a great conversation. So without further delay, here is our interview with Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman. All right, we are joined today by Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman, Associate Professor of American Ethnic Studies and Sociology at the University of Washington, Seattle, and author of Grandmothering While Black, a 21st century story of love, coercion, and survival. LaShawnDa, thanks so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
I'm really excited to be here. I'm so geeked about being in conversation with you. You know so much of the lay of the land around these topics. So
well, I'm honored to hear you say that. I love the title of the book. Love the art, by the way. I meant to ask you, who did that for you? Or did you do it?
No, thank you for starting with that, because I want to do a major shout out to my friend and amazing artist, Juan Macias. I met him while I was in graduate school, actually at Northwestern, and he was a neighbor, was commissioned to do this insane art in the city of Chicago. And when I was looking for artwork for the cover of my book, I couldn't find art that represented a Black grandmother with children. I found a lot of art that was
Mm.
Black mothers. And every time I'd send one that came even remotely close, I would send it to my mom and family and be like, what about this one? My mom would be like, too young, too young. So I sent, I sent Juan an email and I was like, would you be willing to do this? And I was amazed that he said yes, because frankly, this dude is like on another level. And I actually can't even afford to purchase the print yet, but he painted it, brought in a photographer, took pictures of it, sent it to the University of California Press. They couldn't believe that it was commissioned and were like, absolutely, yes.
Oh my God, I'm so glad I asked. That is so true though. Like it's in one way, I do think probably one of the things that people glide by or make assumptions is like, oh, kinship care, grandmother's care. So it's like all these old ladies in walkers taking care of babies. No way. I mean, that definitely happens. But I mean, it's a lot of like, 40, 50-year
That's
olds.
right.
But if you try to do that in art, it would not come through. I agree with
Yeah,
you there. It's like if you did have a younger looking woman, people would be like, what is this about? Like that would be, yeah. All right, so before we start talking about Grandmother in While Black, let's get these guys to know you a little bit. You got to give me at least one favorite. The categories are TV show or movie, musical group, book, or sports team. LaShawnDa, what do you got?
this was easy for me.
Okay.
My favorite musician, hands down, and I love music, and yet she is the queen of soul for a reason, Aretha Franklin. She's got a tune for every mood, every emotion you can experience. So, yeah, she's my favorite. I took it pretty hard when she passed away.
Yeah, well, the whole city I'm in, I live in Detroit. It's
Okay,
she's
so
God here for sure. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
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 They named a music venue after her the next day. It was
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like I discovered her older stuff in college and I was like, wait a minute, what generation was I not born into that I didn't get exposed to this earlier? But and you know what else I loved about her in addition to just like her pipes and just her spirit, you feel it in her music. She never stopped wanting to like evolve as a
no,
musician. Like
yeah.
even up until she passed, she was like learning different languages and playing with the piano, doing different things. I mean, like really was like a lifelong learner. So,
Well said.
yeah,
Well said. Great pick. You're the first to pick Aretha Franklin.
I'm just
Mark
saying,
it down.
represent. Yeah.
So this book in a way, I think of it as an academic work. You came at it academically, but it doesn't read that way. Like there's some aspect of that to it, but it's much more narrative than than what you'd think an academic book would come across. But I do want to start with just your process for this thing. Give me, you don't have to go into too much detail about this, but I'm curious like how you conceived of the methodology, how long it took, why Chicago, because I guess you could kind of pick anywhere to do something like this. So to tell folks kind of how you decided on the path this was going to go.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it was like a perfect storm of things. So I did my master's thesis on Black women and psychological well-being, was at a conference and met this group of older women, Black scholars sociologists who were like, we wonder how this would all look for a group of older Black women. So that seed got planted. And then I was doing my what's called special fields paper at Northwestern, which is kind of a comprehensive exam. And it was on the social capital of disadvantaged youth. And grandparents were a big part of that. Like disadvantaged youth, grandparents go like they're like primary safety net.
Mm.
And then lastly, I was taking this methods class and this amazing methodologist, Art Stinchcomb, who was at Northwestern at the time, was like, if you want to understand something, sometimes the best way to get at it is to look at an extreme version of it. And I was interested in Black women and resilience. And all of that kind of came together with like me thinking about a group of Black women who were experiencing a great deal of adversity and they were faring better than you would anticipate looking at, like, for instance, mental health outcomes. And not to say that they were faring, like not to romanticize the experience, but you would expect that given aging, parenting a second or third generation, doing it in poverty, doing it in the midst of family conflict too often, or without a parent involved, navigating institutions that are like created for parents, but not grandparents raising grandchildren, that it doesn't get any more. And so I decided on that population. And knew that the kinds of things that I was interested in getting at about their experiences couldn't be gotten at quantitatively. Like I needed to sit down with these women and talk to them about this experience from their own perspectives and look at some of the challenges that they were experiencing raising these grandchildren, the things that made those challenges better or worse, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty much how. And then I was in grad school in Chicago, and it made it easy to do, yes, but also I would say that Chicago is like notoriously one of the worst cities in the country for the overrepresentation of Black children within the child welfare system. And so it made it, and it's incredibly segregated. There's a lot of poverty. So there were, sadly, all of the things that I was kind of looking for in a study.
Yeah, and I would say also just to add, Chicago has obviously ongoing and well documented problems handling the kids who are in foster care well. Also
Yep.
takes a very low rate of kids in, but relies a lot on diversion to relatives. So it kind
Yeah.
of does create
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. And lastly, I'll say I did that research as part of my dissertation. Then I got some funding to go back and look at grandmothers who were raising grandchildren who needed childcare because grandparents, as we know, provide a lot of childcare in this country. And when these women are parenting children, it's like, well, then who do they turn to for childcare? And childcare became such an issue when I was interviewing them because women who were still in the labor market who were getting strapped with babies
Hmm.
were like, they're the
Yeah.
ones, they're big mama. People bring their kids to them. So who do they go to? And so that then I went back and did more interviews. For that, I had a really great research assistant, Carolyn Barnes, who's now at Duke, who helped me with those interviews. And I'll also say, John, that I've continued to stay around this topic. So I conducted that research back in the 2000s, did my postdoc in Atlanta, sat on the board of a nonprofit that dealt with grandparents raising grandchildren of kids with disabilities. Then I came out here to Seattle and I've continued to stay involved in the kinship care community here. And so once I got into the field, I fell in love with these families and I knew that I would pretty much continue to do work around them.
There's a specific group of grandparents that are the core of this work. I want to say, I'm messing remember, is it 74?
Yep.
74.
Yep.
So did you come at that? This is such a wonky question. I mean, I may leave this out for everybody else, but I'm curious. Did you come at that as like a goal sample number, or is that just how many you got to interview? Like, how did that number come about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I interviewed 50 for my dissertation,
Uh-huh.
which was kind of gold standard at the time. And then I got funding to interview the additional set of grandparents who were raising grandchildren 5 and under, but that was a diverse group of women across race, ethnicity. And so I picked for this book Black women from that
Hmm.
sample. So the 50 combined with the 24 of the larger group of women. So I interviewed more than 74 women, but those are the 74 Black women.
And did you come at it trying to? I know this makes it more complicated if you do it, but like, I need a certain number who have had this experience, like actual foster
Yep.
care, and you did. You try to get at least a
Yeah.
critical mass of each one. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's interesting. I was just talking to a group of grad students in a public policy class yesterday, and one of the things that I talked about was that, when I first came to this, I was like, I want to look at grandparent caregiving. John, it took me 3 interviews to realize grandparent caregiving in a multi-generational house is very different than grandparent caregiving in a skip generation household.
Mm.
And so
Hmm.
I then stepped back and was like, okay. I'm going to look at skip generation households because those grandparents have to navigate child rearing institutions too often without parents and institutions that are set up for parents, not grandparents,
Yeah.
raising children. And so I wanted to look at variability or variation within that group. And the best way to do that was to say, yes, the bulk of caregiving happens informally outside of the child welfare system, as you know. But for Black and American, Indian, Alaska Native families, that involvement also includes the child welfare system more than other groups. So, like, let me look at variation by child welfare system involvement.
Mm.
And
Hmm.
that just became like a whole other thing because it is such a complex system. And this is what I was talking to the public policy students about yesterday. Like, this whole sort of like formal versus informal as just the ultimate breakdown, just to unpack either
Yeah.
one of those categories is so much more complicated today than it used to be. And so this book turned into really getting at that complexity because guess what? These families are facing those
Yeah.
complexities. And I wanted to center that. And it's needed. It's
Yeah,
really needed.
for sure. So, I mean, you wrote the book about Black grandmothers. I think I have an idea of the answer to this, having read it. But was your goal to try and identify, what's unique about grandmothering while Black, as contrasted to the knowledge base we have overall, or was it more to produce, just a definitive accounting of Black grandmothering without really concern for how does it compare to anywhere else or all that?
Yeah, I would definitely say the latter. And I think largely to the degree that there's comparison, I think there's comparison just based on the statistics alone, right? So the
Hmm.
fact that like Black grandmothers have this really unique position of being more likely to be raising grandchildren in skip generation households without a parent or a partner. Like that is unique, right? So, and I also really wanted to compare it to Black grandmothers of the past, which I think is really important. So it's not just about comparing Black grandmothers to other groups today, but to even ideas and experiences of Black grandmothers historically, which my second book looks at. So I was able to like write a lot more confidently in this first book because I looked at Black grandmothers' experiences beginning in slavery. And so, it's really quite deep to look at sort of this post civil rights moment where there's all of this opportunity on the one hand, which is absolutely true, right? We have more Black folks in the middle class and all these kinds of things. And yet at the same time, you got in the post civil rights era mass incarceration, the overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system, still insanely amazing, like insane amounts of residential segregation and isolation. So I wanted to really get at those things that impact Black grandmothering today that were not something that our historic counterparts had to deal with.
Gotcha. That was actually going to be my next question, is what you make, because you do say that several times in the book that grandparent caregiving has fundamentally changed in post-civil rights. So that's what you mean is mass incarceration, over involvement in child welfare. Those two
Well,
things
I was
really were not as
yeah,
present
well, I think
before.
the things that their grandchildren are dealing with are very different. We now have drug epidemics in this country that are affecting most communities, but it all trickles down. And so, like I look at the
Mm,
impact of that in the African American community. You've got mass incarceration affecting parenting. We've got neoliberalism affecting the kinds of like resources that are available to families and living wages and affordable housing and all those
yeah.
kinds of things. And then you've got like this sort of like overrepresentation of Black families in the child welfare system. And also, I would say the third thing, which I think is really important, is that we also now live in an era of needing paper for a lot of things, right? Like it used to be you could go get a kid, enrolled in school or take it to a doctor's visit. Today, it's like, do you have legal authority to do either one of those things? And so we live in a much more paper-driven society where legal authority has to be demonstrated. And so I think all of those things have changed about great grandmothering compared to our, historical experiences.
I thought, as it pertains to this issue of grandparent caregiving, there was one phrase that, well, one word of it's a bit wonky and academic, I think is really beautiful in capturing the essence of what you're laying out here and what a lot of this discussion is around. And that is the simultaneity of love and coercion. That phrase, you know, there's probably not a single one of these grandmothers that you deeply talked to and interviewed that wanted to raise another generation of kids, but all did so via different forms of pressure. And in actuality, any one of them could have like procedurally avoided it if they really wanted to, but someone or something coerced them to do so. And it's, I think it's easy to say, especially, when the state involved, that CPS is the coercion, and that's true. But the sense of it's the sense of family integrity as you read their responses that you share in the book that really is the main driver. Even when CPS is at the door, you could say no, but it's not that. It's the duty to family and that sense, right?
Man, listen, you know, I was sharing this with someone like in this last week. I was at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was a visiting scholar. And I remember presenting like earlier versions of this book. And there was an older Black man in the audience who said, when I was talking about the idea of coercion, well, don't you think they just love their grandchildren? And I'm like, of course they do. Like both and, right? Like we don't like to deal with nuance, right? Like only love could do this. Only love could make you 80 raising great grandchildren. When you want to sell your house and go live in a retirement community, as you read one of the stories
Yes.
in my book, this 80-something-year-old couple, you know, only love could do that. And at the same time, when given a choice, and this was why I had to step back and look and say, what did they expect for themselves for this role? Because many are actually have other grandchildren that they're not raising, John. And you get a sense of what grandmothering looks like for them when they have those options. But then there's like a child or a set of children that they end up feeling like they have to raise. And it builds on work that has been sort of really well established around what does coercion and care look like. It's that the status that you're in makes you the primary person to do this, and that is absolutely the grandmother role. Once you do it, it's hard to basically shirk the responsibility because the issues that result in you having to do it are so systemic that they don't get easily resolved in
Mm-mm,
too many
mm-mm.
cases. So it's difficult to opt out once you're in. It begins to consume your personhood or other things that you care about, and that there aren't other good options. And I asked each of the grandmothers this, like, so if you weren't doing this, who else would take care of your grandchild? And some of them have come up with contingency plans, like they had the kids had aunts or uncles, often the case, or their partner, if the grandmother was partnered, would step in and do that role. But at the end of the day, there was no one else who would be primarily
Mm-hmm.
raising that child right now. And so that's what coercion looks like. And then you add to that, I argue, coerced mothering is when you add that layer of coercion, but coercion not just to care, but to mother. So you're doing the social and legal functions of motherhood without the legal rights, right? And
Oh yeah.
so
Yep.
only parents have legal rights to children and the state. And so those are also forms of coercion. And, it's just, man, it was really deep to kind of unpack that and really get at how does that show up?
Yeah. I don't know if this is profound in any way, but it's almost like if you visualize it as a tower of coercion, and that base level, the most important is probably that love itself is coercive. CPS pushing for you to do it, or a sense of obligation or pride, but at the end of the day, it like love is the one on the bottom. It is itself
Yeah,
coercive
I mean, just,
in
well,
a good
yeah,
way. I
or,
mean, I
or
guess.
even
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
idea that, like, you know, this like this vehement belief, like, nobody's going to hurt my grandchild. Like that,
Yeah.
when you talk about love as a coercive force, like this is mine. Like I will hurt the mama before I let
Yeah.
somebody hurt my like that. It's so
Right.
profound. I mean, it makes me really
Yeah.
emotional, and that's in part why I like stayed around this population, because it's so awe-inspiring. Like it's like, whoa, and just how these women would fight. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating is that so many of them resisted, like, mother, right? But by the time they were done fighting for the welfare of their grandchildren, they were since becoming that. Like they were becoming mama bears. They were becoming mothers in a sense.
Yeah.
So that was
And can I tell you one thing I am frankly ashamed to say had not really occurred to me until I read your book and read some of the experiences that you document is just the simple fact that not any time, but any situation where a grandmother is becoming a long-term caregiver for a child, that child loses a grandmother. They lose a grandmother. If I could be so bold as to read a piece of your book to you and to
Yes.
our listeners here, so you don't have to do it. This is a quick one, but this is from an interview that Dr. Pittman did with Eliza. This is Eliza saying, "I can't be so free with you," parentheses, grandchildren in our care, "because you're here with me every day, and there are certain things that you have to learn that you can't get away with. But if you were not, you could get away with the world. So I miss that." And that just hit me because it's so true. Like, she probably wanted to do nothing but spoil a grandchild rotten for 18 years. And instead, she had just a fundamentally different experience. And so did the child.
I love that you brought that up for so many reasons. And I think it's something that happens to me when I do interviews. People assume my grandmom raised me because I'm so passionate about this population. And I'm like, she did not actually. I have a teenage mom, not anymore. but at one point she was a teenager. And my grandmother, by extension, was very involved. And I got that grandmom that you're talking about. I got to be spoiled rotten by both grandparents and great grandparents, by the way. And I'm the firstborn. So if you can say spoiled on top of spoiled on top of spoiled, that would be me. And I also got to learn things from my grandmother that I always say my grandfather spoiled me and my grandmother taught me that I would not have been able to get if she were raising me every day. Like, there were just things that I got about her life because we weren't in the throes of, get up, get dressed for school. You got to get your homework. Let me make sure you ate. Let me deal with whatever issue you're having because your mama or your daddy ain't here. And so there is something lost. And many of the grandmoms talked about grieving that their grandchild was, one, denied their parent because they wanted to be supplemental parents, not primary parents, and that they were themselves denied that. Uh, and then one of the things they talked about were, and it didn't make it into the book as much, but the strategies they use to try to minimize the difference in how they treated the grandchildren that were just there visiting versus those who they were raising. And so that was also a little bit heartbreaking.
For 2 decades, Fostering Families Today magazine has educated families raising and supporting children and youth in foster care. Delivered in print or online 6 times each year, Fostering Families Today gives families the latest tips, strategies, and research on caring for children with traumatic backgrounds. Use promo code PODCAST5 to save $5 on a print or digital subscription today. Just go to fosteringfamilies.today.com/subscribe and enter PODCAST5 to save $5 on your subscription. That's fosteringfamilies.today.com/subscribe.
As you said earlier, this was not a quantitative task. It was a qualitative one. So then I went and ruined that by quantitating myself into this question. But no, in all seriousness, LaShawnDa does a very helpful job early on by charting all this out. So like, we're talking about the 74 women that she interviewed. There is you can get a good idea of like sort of them, their situation, how many kids were involved, and then also what the sort of nature of the kinship caregiving. I went through and just tallied it up for myself because I was curious. And of the 74, 8 of them had experienced a kinship diversion, which I'm gonna get, that can mean different things to different people, but I'm gonna guess that means CPS was involved and they sort of dispensed of it without formal procedure, right? They just moved the kid over. So 8 in that box, 23 in foster care, 9 of them unlicensed, and then 8 who subsequently got into subsidized guardianship or adoption. Forgive me if any of those numbers are wrong. I did it on Excel a couple days ago in preparation.
There's a table.
Oh, that counts it up? Oh, man. Now it cost me some time. Yeah. So I think my question on that is, was it surprising to you that almost half this cohort was CPS involved cases? I think this sort of like the tail of the tape broadly on kinship caregiving is that many, 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 many more are doing it without involvement in CPS, but your
Yeah,
group would tell about 50%, a little less, but
I'll say this. So one of the things I think is important to note is that once I made that decision early on to look at skip generation households, I went in looking for those grandmothers who were raising
yeah.
children under the child welfare system.
Okay.
So I don't think the numbers that I have represent the proportionality in the bigger population. I wanted to get at all of these different kind of care arrangements because, John, there are a lot of them. I think in Illinois at the time that I was in the field, there were 9. That's not small.
Yeah.
And so for these families to have to make decisions about care type, people talk about kinship care arrangements like it's just kind of like
one monolithic thing. It's not. Yeah. There's so many different ones.
It has so many implications for
Yeah.
the kind of rights the grandparent has, the kind of resources and services they have, the kind of rights the parent has. And so I oversample in some cases. For instance, I really wanted to look at kinship adoption, which I can't remember if this is off the top of my head, but like there were some private adoptions, but like that kinship adoption is becoming more of a thing. For instance, one of the things that I didn't know anything about before getting into the field, frankly, was the point that you're bringing up about kinship diversion. Like I was like, what is this? And it was called different things by the grandmoms. And so having to actually figure out that this thing they were talking about when they talked about safety plans was kinship diversion, because to your point, different DCFSs call it different things. Child welfare systems call it different things. So I went in, then I was like, okay, what I need to figure out what this thing is that's happening to families. And so I went in looking for those things and those kinds of kinship care arrangements. And the more entrenched families were in the child welfare system, it was actually more difficult to get them. For several reasons. One is I feel like those families definitely probably were more guarded about their experiences because the child welfare system, they were so afraid that if they shared the wrong thing, that their grandchildren could be taken. But then also just kind of like once I started getting an understanding of all of these different kinds of kinship care arrangements, it's like, okay, I've had enough kinship foster care parents. Now, let me look at the ones who go either the subsidized guardianship direction or the kinship adoption direction, and then trying to get snowball samples and connecting with the social service agencies that were dealing with them. Do you have any who are, providing care in this way? And so it was increasingly difficult to get at those who were.
Yeah. So you mentioned subsidized guardianships and adoption. I think of that group that I just described, I think the thing I was most surprised at is that of the CPS involved cases, licensed foster care with a full foster care payment was the predominant arrangement, because I think you do have a lot of concern around the country about kin being presented with a certain set of options that don't quite make it clear to them what they may benefit from if they did go that route. I've heard that, like we've published some stories about that in like Nevada, a couple other states where that's it seems like maybe in Chicago they are being told that that is a way to go. But the more interesting thing was there are, like I said, there's 8 of these grandmothers where subsidized guardianship occurred or an adoption that wasn't private. And all of them first went through the foster care door. I'm struggling to explain why that to me that mattered a lot. Was like, if your sample is representative of the experience, that means it's like the only path to getting that subsidized guardianship or adoption subsidy is through foster care. And that
Absolutely.
Grandmothers who agree to diversion or do anything informally have no chance at one of these arrangements, which I think is probably something we should be talking a little bit more about if that is the case.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you on that. And I'm actually putting those numbers in the chat from.
Well, I'll just read this for listeners. Actually, this is all really helpful. So at the time of the interview, grandmothers provided care in 24 private kinship arrangements, 31 legal guardianships, 9 kinship foster care arrangements, 3 subsidized guardianships, 6 kinship adoptions, and 1 private adoption.
And one of the things that I also think is really important about this, John, is that, man, and I love that we're having this conversation. This gets me all excited. So one of the things that I think is really important about this too is that these kinship arrangements change over time. So you have one grandmother who could have had 3 different kinship care arrangements and
Right.
could talk to you about any one of those. And so I actually say next that as they cared for their grandchildren, women in this study had experience with each type of care. 26 kinship foster care, 6 kinship adoption, 3 subsidized guardianship, 1 private adoption, 36 legal guardianships, 10 kinship diversions, and 43 with private kinship care. So they could have been, like, for instance, starting as private kinship care, whatever situation was happening with parents didn't evolve or change, or it did evolve or change, and they decided they need legal guardianship.
Yeah.
Or they started with kinship foster care and moved to subsidized. And to your point, that was the only pathway to subsidized guardianship or to kinship adoption subsidies. Providing care outside of the child welfare system was informal kinship care, period. And that relegated these families to the TANF system, where there were fewer resources and services available.
Right. And I try to explain all acronyms on the show, not assume. So Dr. Pittman just referred to TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which I'm pretty sure most people listening will know. Let's talk about that, actually. So I think most folks listening know that foster care payments are something that, occur with state and federal participation. TANF is sort of what kinship caregivers get if they're not in the formal foster care system as a provider. It's usually a lot less. Some unlicensed foster parents unlicensed kids don't get anything, but in a lot of states they'll offer that TANF, child only. What were the most frequently tapped, other sources of indirect or direct income that you came across in your research here? Any that surprised you? Or like, oh, I didn't know that was a big thing.
I think one of the things I was really struck by was how many, and there was a webinar that I did with some folks at the Institute for Research on Poverty, which I mentioned earlier. And one of them is looking at the impact of Social Security benefits for these families.
Mm-hmm.
And like just how many grandmothers were living on just their Social Security. And that was it. Social Security and maybe SNAP, which supplemental, what is it?
Food stamps and
Food stamps, food stamp nutrition program.
Yes,
nutrition assistance program. And so I think like the really important role of Social Security benefits was something that really struck me, and not just their own. In many cases, it was just their own, but there was at least a few grandmothers who were living on the Social Security benefits of the grandchildren in their care. And so I think that to the degree that there's another sort of like set of resources that are available to these families, I would say that that's a primary one. And as you know, like absolutely provides more support than public assistance. And so at the time that I was in the field, TANF child only grants, which are grants that go to the children without factoring in the caregiver's income and resources, that grant was $107 a month. And so here you were at times making these women jump through hoops, giving them misinformation about what the eligibility criteria was and so on and so forth for $107 a month. So you can see why way too many of them just walked away.
Yeah.
They're like, well, you're telling me I need legal guardianship to have this, which they actually did not. Or, I need proof of legal guardianship was probably the biggest one in terms of just kind of misinformation.
Yeah.
Then no, then I'm not going to necessarily go and do that. But Social Security, because at least those payments were between $400 and $600 a month.
It's hard to speak on speak for 74 different women, but if you could kind of divine the common threads to the extent you can, what sort of perceptions did these grandparents have of CPS and their role both in their lives and that of the parents, their children?
Man, I would say more than anything, burdensome. And so I think I'll start with sort of the different pathways to CPS, because I think we often think about CPS as something that is brought into these families' lives from the outside. And without any other resources within these communities to resolve family conflict, that shows up around the care of children. And because grandparents don't have legal rights, CPS becomes the tool in poor neighborhoods, which are, we know BIPOC folks are overrepresented in poor communities, or poor communities are overrepresented among BIPOC, among people of color. And so that becomes too often, in a sense, the resource to then figure out, how do I protect my grandchild? How do I get the legal rights I need to protect my grandchild? And it was really interesting to like follow the pathway and the experiences of the grandmothers who themselves got on the phone and made that call, that difficult call, sometimes just trying to like provide like a hypothetical situation to somebody who answered the call, like, well, what would happen if this were happening? What are my options? Or they would say this to their public aid worker. And so even getting that kind of information and what was then required in order to get the support they needed was burdensome. So even in the best case scenario, it's that you essentially have to prove that your own child is unfit, which many grandparents are not inclined to do. Even if their child needs help, they don't want to make their child's life difficult in the getting of that help, because is what the child welfare system going to provide help? In many cases, it is not, right? Because the child welfare system is not providing root cause investments into individuals, right? They're not providing better job support or housing support or transportation and those kinds of things. And so that it became a burdensome thing. How do I do this and leave my child intact to the degree that I can, and then also protect my grandchild? So that involved, proving the parent was unfit. So that's a court visit, that's a caseworker coming out to the household, filling out paperwork. How do I share enough that gets my grandchild into my care, but not share so much that then they start investigating me? Or, and so they're like that. It's burdensome, right? So, but this is the only game in town. How else do I do this? There is no other way. And then you've got the ones that the child welfare system is brought to them, to their front door or on their telephone, because they're the last front line or the last line for if that this kid is going to end up in the child welfare system. And then now I've got to jump through all of these hoops to then get my grandchild in my care and to keep my grandchild in my care. So I would say it's burdensome.
Yeah.
Yes, it comes with more resources and services than those who are providing care informally, but it's a lot. It is a huge sacrifice and a big cost to these families that it comes with such a heavy weight, one way or another. Either they're directly getting it, their children are getting it, and sometimes their grandchildren. Their grandchildren are too often aware of what this all means.
I think that this is confirmatory of what you're describing too, is that, the experiences you relate from these grandmothers really does not suggest, unless I missed one or two, that they did not agree that an intervention needed to happen, right? Like they largely believed that their grandchildren were not safe and there needed to be a change, at least for a period of time. So it wasn't the case where really, right? Like I'm trying to think of any instance in this book where somebody said, I didn't think my child needed to not have her child for
there was one.
Okay. Yeah.
There was one. And she, oh my God, this it was an amazing interview. She was like, it was around corporal punishment. And she was of that school of thought that the child got put in his place. She did not agree with the assessment that he'd been abused. And so she was raising her teenage great grandson and was pissed off about it. She was just like, it was, I'm laughing because she was pissed off and it was a funny interview in that way, but also it was heart-wrenching because I remember distinctly one of the things that she said was that she hoped that she had enough life left at the end of this to still have some for herself. And so, yeah, that was a difficult situation for her family. Her granddaughter couldn't come to her house. And they were a small, close-knit family. So like she said, it just broke their family all apart. But that was the one case where they did not agree.
And you described it the other way, but I also thought it was really interesting. There were several grandmothers that related, like we just kind of blew by the rules around like no parent visitation. And it really spoke to the idea that, you know, they whether the system agreed or not, they wanted the door open for like, yeah, maybe when I'm 80, I can finally retire from raising kids, and she can come back. And I think Nell particularly as a good example of that, where she was, you know, just mom was taking the kids for the summer basically.
Yep.
Also a good example of how, you know, it was interesting how Nell called CPS. They were like, can't help you. And then just some random person in the neighborhood called, and it was like 5-alarm fire, which needed to happen. As Nell, you know, she's like, yeah, she shouldn't have been there, but I told you that months ago.
And it could have been avoided that my grandchildren then got placed in non-relative foster care. And you know, the family had to become licensed foster parents. Yeah, I think that there were those cases where it was really difficult to get the information that they needed to be proactive in a sense.
Yeah. So, you know, in, you know, kind of the appendix, really, where you kind of do a nice little kind of walk through the policy stuff. I thought that was actually smart to not weigh down a compelling book with all the stuff that we write about a lot. And just sort of save it to the end for the people that really want that extra dessert, the wonk dessert at the end. But you kind of expressed optimism about the Family First Act, which, you know, was passed in 2018. It's kind of the first time that the federal main child welfare entitlement is open to actually spending on prevention of foster care. But what makes you optimistic that you know, might change things to the better for kinship caregivers, particularly grandmothers?
You know, it's interesting. I think that given the system we have, which is a very punitive system, right? To the degree that we can funnel more resources to parents and prevention and support children remaining with their parents, then there is less of a need for kinship care. So I think it doesn't, there's been an increase in kinship navigation programs as a result, and that's been really amazing to watch. Like, I think that they do such important work. I mean, like I can't state what they do enough in terms of helping increase the access to the resources that are there, especially for the bulk of families raising children outside of the child welfare system. And so that's my sense of hopefulness about the system that we have, that we can give parents more support and keeping children in their care, versus even having them in the care of other relatives.
You also tackle, actually, I think you do this in the actual text, not afterwards, you know, the more recent pushes for really thinking about this less as changing the system, like Family First is kind of a change to what we have, to, you know, people who are advocating for abolition or just a much, you know, more wholesale change. Whatever lane of that or flavor of that, you're right. A lot of that has to do with moving away from the government and towards community. So, you know, you've had these deep conversations about the stuff of 74 grandparents. How would you envision, you know, a community-based response working where a grandmother knew a child wasn't safe? They needed, you know, to be extricated, at least in a short-term way, from their home. How would that community-based response work in terms of getting that grandparent help and, you know, taking on the responsibility of a caretaker, at least for a short time?
Yeah, I love that. So I think one is, first of all, changing who we think about as experts in making those decisions. You know, I think that's a very paternalistic model, that those decisions should be made by often caseworkers who have whatever viewpoints about these families, come from different communities, maybe come from the same community. But what if we actually positioned people within communities, like we actually have done, by the way? You know, so I think it's important to note that for much of our history in this country, even post-slavery, Black folks were excluded largely from the child welfare system. We were either excluded or given inferior services. So guess what? Black kids got taken care of one way or another. Not all of them, absolutely. So I'm not going to romanticize that time period, but there were mechanisms in place that did some of that work. And so I think that it's a bit paternalistic to think that this can't happen without major government oversight. And so I think resituating sort of who the experts are who help make those decisions. I see community members that are advisory boards and help mediate these relationships. And yes, we have to pay them something, but we're paying private agencies that do a lot of this work anyway, and they are making lots of money to do it. And so what if we actually supported community in helping families make those really challenging decisions themselves, and doing it in the spirit of love and compassion, which is frankly something that many of these grandmoms want. How many grandparents or parents want to see their children suffer more because they're not getting the kind of help they really need? And so I think starting in a place like that and giving communities the support they need, to give people the training they need, having it be agreed upon what that training could look like. And yeah, it's definitely going to take governance and some bureaucracy, but look at the bureaucracy we have. Look at what that 5-tiered system of kinship care looks like. I mean, it's not becoming easier. And we're seeing that the issues that create the need for grandparent caregiving are not going away. In fact, we're becoming a more unequal society. And so I suspect that this isn't changing anytime soon. So what would it look like to actually bring in folks who have experience on the ground with these issues and support their efforts to keep their families together? And frankly, my work as of yet has not created and thought through. I think there are people who do that work. Like there's Dorothy Roberts' work, Torn Apart. There's the Upend movement with Alan Detlef. And I think there are folks who are thinking about what a model of that could look like. So it's not, you see the same thing in policing, right? There's so many great models of community policing. And so it's not a lack of imagination. It's just a lack of the political will to say, can these communities do this work themselves? And it's not to say the work doesn't need to be done. Children should be safe, period. They should be safe and they should be well cared for. And it isn't only the government that can make that happen, because for many communities, the government has been harmful in that endeavor more than it's been helpful. And so I think that thinking outside the box in that way, I think it would be I think many of the grandmothers would want that. They didn't want to be calling CPS. They don't want CPS in their business, in their homes, telling them what to do with their families. But guess what? If it is the only game in town, that's the one they have to play.
The book is called Grandmothering While Black. Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman, thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Oh, thank you. This was great. I've been itching to have a conversation with you, so I'm glad we finally did.
Thanks to Dr. LaShawnDa Pittman, author of Grandmothering While Black, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.